first noticed him when I went out to refill the bird feeder. A kid, maybe 10 or 11, sitting on the front stoop of my cabin, arms wrapped around his knees, head down. His sneakers were scuffed, laces undone, and there was a hole in one knee of his jeans. He wasn't crying, but he looked like he wanted to. I set the seed bucket down and took a slow breath. I'd seen that look before, kids who come through here with their parents, the ones who pretend therapy is just a vacation in the woods. The ones who don't get a say in whether they stay or go. "Hey, kid," I said, keeping my voice light. "You lost?" He shook his head. "You are the clients?" A pause. Then, a small nod. I sat down on the top step, leaving a couple feet between us. The wood creaked beneath me. "Want me to guess why you're out here instead of in there?" I jerked my head toward the cabins down the path, where families were supposed to be having their healing weekends. Another nod. "Let me guess," I said. "Parents brought you here to fix something. But they're the ones who can't stop fighting." This time, he looked up. Just for a second, but it was enough. I saw it in his face, the tightness in his jaw, the anger mixed with sadness, the exhaustion of a kid who's had to listen to too much yelling for too many nights. "Yeah," he mumbled. I leaned back on my hands, looking out at the trees. The pines swayed in the wind, whispering secrets to each other. "You know, I get a lot of folks here who think therapy is about proving they're right. They want someone to tell them they're the good guy, the other person's the problem. But therapy doesn't work like that." The kid kicked a rock off the step. "They just fight about dumb stuff. They act like I can't hear, but I do." I nodded. "That's the worst part, huh? Not just the fighting, but the pretending you don't notice." He sniffed. "Yeah." I let the silence settle between us. Sometimes, quiet does more than words. I knew he didn't need a lecture. He needed space. A moment to not be in the middle of it all. After a while, I stood up. "Tell you what, kid. I was about to make some hot chocolate. You want some?" He hesitated. "I don't know if I should." "Suit yourself," I said, stretching. "But I make a mean hot chocolate. And I always put extra marshmallows." That got tiny, almost small of him. I left the door open when I went inside. A minute later, I heard the soft creak of the stoop as he followed. Maybe I couldn't fix his parents. Maybe no one could. But for now, I could give him a warm drink, a safe place, and a little bit of peace. And sometimes, that was enough. I busied myself in the kitchen, giving him time to decide whether he wanted to talk or just exist in the space. The kid lingered near the doorway at first, his fingers twitching at the hem of his hoodie like he wasn't sure if he belonged here. I didn't push. Instead, I focused on the cocoa, letting the scent of melting chocolate and warm milk fill the air. I heard the soft shuffle of his sneakers against the floor. A moment later, he eased into one of the chairs at the small wooden table. "Got a name?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He hesitated, then muttered, "Evan." "Nice to meet you, Evan." I poured the cocoa into 2 mismatched mugs, topping them with an embarrassing amount of marshmallows. "Hope you like sugar, 'cause I don't hold back." Evan took the mug while I handed it to him, cupping it in both hands like he was trying to soak in the warmth. He didn't sip right away, just stared into it, the steam curling against his face. I took the seat across from him and blew on my cocoa. "You been here before?" He shook his head. "First time." "Oh. What do you think so far?" A shrug. "It's quiet." "That it is." He took a small sip, flinching when it was hotter than he expected. I pretended not to notice, just took a careful sip of my own. After a few beats of silence, he asked, "You live here?" "Yep." "By yourself?" "Mostly." I glanced toward the window, where a pair of squirrels were squabbling over the bird feeder. "Got some furry neighbors, though." That got another almost smile out of him. He took a longer sip of cocoa, then mumbled, "My parents are probably looking for me." I tilted my head. "Think they're worried?" Evan didn't answer right away. Then, softly, they're probably just mad. I sighed through my nose, setting my mug down. Listen, kid. I don't know your parents, and I don't know what's going on with them. But I do know this, whatever's happening, it's not your fault. His fingers tightened around the mug. Yeah, well, doesn't feel like that. I get that. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. And I'm not saying it doesn't suck. But you didn't break them, and it's not your job to fix them. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. For a second, I thought he might argue, might insist that if he just behaved better, tried harder, maybe things would go back to how they used to be. But then he let out a breath. A long, tired breath that shouldn't belong to a kid his age. His voice wavered, and he stared down at his cocoa. I just wish they'd stop. I nodded. Yeah. Me too. Silence settled between us again, not heavy this time, just there. I let it stay, let it do the work words couldn't. Eventually, he finished his cocoa. He set the mug down carefully, like he didn't want to make a sound. I stood and stretched, acting like this was just another normal afternoon. You can hang out here as long as you need, Evan. But if you want to head back, I can walk with you. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. We stepped outside together. The sky was soft with the first hints of dusk, the air cool but not biting. As we walked, I kept my pace easy, unhurried. I didn't fill the silence with pointless chatter. Some things didn't need fixing. Some things just needed witnessing, and if that's all I could do for Evan tonight, then I'd make damn sure I did it right. We walked down the gravel path, our footsteps crunching softly against the earth. The air smelled like pine and damp wood, the kind of scent that settled deep in your lungs and made you feel small in a way that wasn't bad, just quiet. Evan kept his head down, hands shoved in the pocket of his hoodie. I didn't rush him. I didn't say anything at all. Sometimes, silence worked better than words, and I had a feeling this kid had heard plenty of the wrong ones lately. As we neared the cluster of cabins where the family stayed, I slowed my steps. Evan did too, glancing up at the dim porch lights flickering against the trees. He let out breath through his nose. I should probably go in. He didn't sound convinced. I nodded. Yeah. He stood there for a moment longer, staring at the door like it was something he had to force himself to walk through. His fingers twitched at his sleeves, pulling them over his hands. They're probably still arguing, he muttered. I tilted my head. You want to wait a little longer? He hesitated. Then, instead of answering, he turned slightly toward me. You really live out here alone? Pretty much. I rocked back on my heels. I help run this place. Keep things in order, make sure people don't get lost in the woods. He blinked at that, almost like he was considering it. You ever get lost? I huffed a small laugh. Not anymore. He didn't ask what that meant, and I didn't offer. Instead, he looked back at the cabin again, jaw tight. Do the parents ever stop fighting? It was such a simple question, and yet it held so much weight. I rubbed a hand over my chin. Sometimes. And if they don't? I exhaled. Then the kids learn how to carry it. His shoulders tensed, his hands balling into the cuffs of his hoodie. I didn't let the moment stretch too long before I spoke again. But you don't have to do it alone, you know. Even when it feels like it. He was quiet, but I could tell he was listening. The porch light flickered, and inside, the muffled hum of voices carried through the walls. Too low to make out the words, but enough to tell the story. Evan let out another breath. I should go. I nodded. All right. He turned, stepping toward the cabin, but hesitated again at the door. Then, so softly I almost missed it, he mumbled, "Thanks for the hot chocolate." I smiled. "Anytime, kid." He slipped inside, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for a second longer, listening to the sound of the wind through the trees. Then I turned and walked back up the path, letting the night settle around me. Maybe I couldn't fix everything. But maybe, just maybe, I could make it a little easier for someone to carry. The next morning, I was up early, same as always. There was a kind of peace in the quiet before the families woke, before the workshops and group sessions started. Just the sound of the wind in the trees, the birds stirring in their nests, the lake lapping at the shore beyond the cabins. I was out on my porch, drinking my coffee, when I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Evan. He was alone again, hoodie pulled tight around his face, arms crossed against the morning chill. He hesitated at the bottom of the steps, like he wasn't sure if he was actually welcome here or if last night had just been a fluke. I took a sip of my coffee. You look like a kid who could use a warm drink. He let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh, but it was close. You got more hot chocolate? I stood up, stretching. Kid, I got enough cocoa to last a winter. Come on. He followed me inside without another word. We settled at the kitchen table, two mismatched mugs between us, steam curling into the air. Evan stirred his with a spoon, watching the marshmallows melt. You said you help run this place, right? That's right. So, are you a therapist? I smiled into my coffee. Nope. His brow furrowed. Then why do you live here? I leaned back in my chair, considering him for a moment. He wasn't just making conversation. He wanted to know if there was something else, something unsaid. I used to be a client here, I said finally. A long time ago. Evan's stirring slowed. He didn't say anything, just let me keep talking. My parents weren't big on therapy, I said. Thought it was a waste of time. But when things got bad enough, someone convinced them to come here. Evan's fingers tightened around his mug. Did it help? I tilted my head. Not the way they wanted. He frowned. They thought coming here would fix everything, I explained. Like therapy would magically make them stop fighting, stop hurting each other. But that's not how it works. You can't fix something if the people involved don't want to do the work. Evan swallowed. I could see the gears turning in his head, the slow realization settling in his chest. Then why are you still here? He asked. I exhaled. Because this place helped me. Not in the way my parents wanted, but in the way I needed. And now, I try to do the same for other people. Evan was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice so small I almost missed it, he said, I don't think my parents want to do the work either. I nodded. Yeah. That's the worst part, isn't it? His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. I didn't push him to say more. I just sat there, letting the moment be what it was. After a while, Evan sighed and set his spoon down. You ever get sick of hot chocolate? I grinned. Not yet. He actually smiled at that. A real one, even if it was small. It was something. And sometimes, something was enough. Evan kept coming back. Not every day, but often enough that it became a kind of routine. Some mornings, he showed up early, and we'd sit on the porch, drinking cocoa and listening to the birds. Other days, he'd wander over in the evening, when the sky was soft with sunset, and he'd help me refill the bird feeder or gather firewood. He didn't always talk, and I never made him. But little by little, he started sharing pieces of himself. How his parents weren't always like this. How he used to think they'd stop fighting eventually. How now, he wasn't so sure. One afternoon, he asked, what happened to you? After you came here? I looked out at the trees, watching the wind sway through the branches. I left. Evan frowned. What do you mean? I mean, I stopped waiting for my parents to change. Stopped hoping they'd wake up one day and be different. I exhaled. It took a long time. But I built a life that wasn't about them. Evan picked at a loose thread in his hoodie. Did it help? Yeah, I said. It did. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was thinking about it. I didn't expect him to figure it all out overnight. Hell, I didn't expect him to figure it out while he was still a kid. But I hoped, in some small way, that knowing someone else had made it through would help. Because I saw myself in Evan. and I wasn't about to let him think he had to do this alone. The weekend was ending. Families were packing up, loading their cars, making their way down the long road back to wherever they came from. Evan stood outside his cabin, hoodie pulled tight, watching his parents haul their bags to the trunk. I walked up beside him, hands in my pockets. Ready to go? He let out a breath. Not really. I nodded. Yeah. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then, he turned to me. Do you think I'll be okay? I looked at him, really looked at him, and I knew exactly what he was asking. Not today. Not tomorrow. But in the long run. I put a hand on his shoulder, gave it a gentle squeeze. Yeah, kid. I do. His throat bobbed. Then, without a word, he turned and climbed into the car. I watched as they drove away, the dust kicking up in the morning light, until the trees swallowed them whole. And then, I turned back to my cabin, listening to the quiet hum of the wind through the trees. Hoping, for Evan's sake, that one day, the quiet would feel like peace. The days passed, and life at the retreat carried on. New families came and went, each with their own baggage, their own wounds, their own desperate attempts to fix something that had already cracked. Evan's visit settled into memory, the way so many faces did. Some kids you never saw again. Others came back years later, older but carrying the same weight in their shoulders. I wondered which one he'd be. It was nearly a year later when I saw him again. I was stacking firewood behind my cabin when I heard footsteps on the path. At first, I didn't look up. People wandered through all the time, therapists heading to sessions, families taking their morning walks. But then I heard a voice. Hey. I turned. Evan. He was taller, older, but it was him. Hoodie still too big, hands stuffed in his pockets. There was something different in his face, though. Less exhaustion. Less weight in his eyes. I leaned against the woodpile. Well, thought I'd scared you off. He smirked, small but real. Nah. I nodded toward the porch. Hot chocolate? Always. We settled in the kitchen, just like before. The routine was the same, but the silence between us wasn't heavy like it had been that first night. It was familiar now, comfortable. I slid a mug across the table. So, what brings you back? Evan shrugged. My mom's doing a follow-up retreat. She asked if I wanted to come. That surprised me. Yeah. And you actually said yes. He huffed. It was either this or staying home with my dad. So. I nodded, understanding more than I said out loud. He took a sip of his cocoa, then set the mug down. They split up. I blinked. Not at the fact itself, but at the way he said it. Not like it was a tragedy. Not like it was the worst thing that had ever happened to him. Just a fact. I tilted my head. How do you feel about that? He shrugged again, but this time there wasn't as much tension in it. It's better now. I studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. He didn't say anything right away, just ran his finger along the rim of his mug. Then, quietly, he said, I thought it would mean I failed. I frowned. Failed? For a long time, I thought, if I just tried hard enough, they'd stop fighting. That if I did everything right, they'd fix it. I exhaled. Yeah. I know that feeling. He glanced up at me. But I get it now. It wasn't my job to fix them. Something in my chest eased. That's a big thing to realize, I said. Took me a lot longer to figure it out. He smirked again. Guess I'm just smarter than you. I snorted. All right, don't get cocky. For a while, we just sat there, drinking cocoa. The wind outside rustled the trees, soft and steady. Evan leaned back in his chair, looking around the cabin. You think you'll stay here forever? I smiled. Maybe. He nodded, like that answer made sense to him. After a beat, he said, I don't think I'll come back. I raised an eyebrow. No? He shook his head. I think I don't need to anymore. There was no bitterness in it, no sadness. Just certainty. I felt something warm settle on my chest. Good, I said. That's the point. He finished his cocoa and set the mug down. Then, after a second of hesitation, he stood and held out a hand. I stared at it for a second, then grinned and shook it. His grip was firm, steady. Take care, kid, I said. Evan smirked. You too, old man. Then he turned and walked out the door, down the path, and back toward a life that finally felt like his own. And I let him go, knowing he didn't need me to carry his weight anymore. Knowing that, wherever he went, he'd be all right.